The first thing Alana noticed wasn't the scars. It was the apology. A little boy looked at the left side of the man's face for no more than 2 seconds, before the child's mother could pull him away or whisper that familiar, embarrassed, "Don't stare." The man smiled first. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Sorry, not because he'd bumped into anyone, not because he'd interrupted the room. He was apologizing for making complete strangers uncomfortable simply by standing there. Something about that didn't sit right with her. Most people quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't noticed. One volunteer suddenly became very interested in arranging coffee cups. Another started unfolding chairs that didn't need unfolding. The whole room seemed to agree, without saying a word, that looking anywhere except at him would somehow make things easier. Alana did the opposite. She walked over, knelt beside the little boy, and smiled. "It's okay to look," she said gently. "Sometimes people have stories before they have names." The man's fingers tightened around the box he was carrying, not out of anger, more like someone who hadn't heard those words in a very long time. Then the front door opened. Another volunteer stopped mid-step, stared at the quiet man for a second, and whispered just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Wait, do you know who that is?" The room changed before anyone answered, not because they suddenly saw his scars, because they suddenly remembered his name. Before I tell you why that one whispered question changed everything, let me take a brief pause. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. Saturday mornings at the Community Rehabilitation Center usually began the same way. Someone forgot where the coffee filters were. Folding chairs scraped across the floor. A volunteer complained good-naturedly about the weather before anyone had even taken off a jacket. Patients arrived slowly, some with walkers, others with canes, a few determined not to use either, even when they probably should have. Alana Brooks liked those first 30 minutes. People were least guarded before the day officially started. She had just carried a stack of therapy bands into the activity room when she noticed the same man from earlier still working with a box that looked heavier than it needed to be. He wasn't struggling dramatically. He simply refused to ask for help. The cardboard box rested against his hip while he adjusted his grip with one hand. His left shoulder barely moved, and he compensated without seeming aware he was doing it. "That one's full of adaptive weights," Alana said, setting her supplies down. "They're heavier than they look." The man glanced toward her. His smile arrived first, almost automatically. "I figured that out a little late." His voice was calm, rough around the edges in a way that suggested it had once been stronger. She stepped beside him. "Here, I've got it." "I know." She reached for the other side anyway. For a second he hesitated, not because he minded sharing the weight, but because accepting help didn't seem to come naturally anymore. Then he loosened his grip. "Thank you." Together they carried the box into the therapy room. When they set it down, he thanked her again. Not casually. The words sounded deliberate, like gratitude had become one of his daily habits. "You say thank you a lot," Alana observed. He looked almost embarrassed. "My mother would have noticed if I stopped." She laughed softly. "I think I'd like your mother." "You probably would." There was no attempt to keep the conversation going after that. He simply started unpacking equipment, as though silence wasn't something that needed fixing. Alana found herself watching him while organizing resistance bands. He unfolded portable therapy tables before anyone asked. He wiped one down after noticing a fingerprint no one else would have seen. When another volunteer walked in carrying coffee, he immediately stepped aside so she wouldn't have to squeeze past him. "Morning," she said. "Good morning. You got here early." "I don't mind." Nothing about him demanded attention. If anything, he seemed practiced at avoiding it. A few minutes later, an older man recovering from a stroke arrived with his daughter. The volunteer at the welcome desk was helping someone else, so the man waited awkwardly near the entrance. Before anyone noticed, the quiet volunteer was already there. "Would you like a hand?" The older man nodded. Without making a production of it, he carried the man's therapy bag while matching his slower pace all the way to the seating area. He never spoke loudly enough for anyone else to hear. He never acted as though he deserved appreciation. When the daughter thanked him, he answered with the same small smile. Happy to. Alana had spent years working around people who genuinely cared. She had also met people who wanted to be seen caring. The difference was usually obvious. This man behaved exactly the same whether someone noticed or not. That interested her, not because it was extraordinary, because it had become uncommon. As more volunteers arrived, conversations filled the room. Someone switched on the radio. A patient joked about finally beating his grandson at checkers. Coffee was poured. Clipboards appeared. The ordinary rhythm of the center settled in. The man quietly drifted toward the background. It was almost impressive. He had a face people inevitably noticed, yet somehow he carried himself in a way that encouraged them to stop looking as quickly as possible. Whenever someone unfamiliar approached, he shifted slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough that the unscarred side of his face naturally faced them first. It wasn't calculated. It looked like muscle memory. Years of learning how to make strangers less uncomfortable. Alana caught herself noticing the pattern 3 times before she realized he probably had no idea he was doing it. A little later, a young volunteer arrived with her 6-year-old son. The boy wandered curiously through the room while his mother signed attendance forms. Children rarely knew the rules adults created around visible injuries. They simply looked. The boy stopped. His eyes settled on the man's scars. The room hadn't changed. No one else seemed aware of it. Then the man looked up. Their eyes met. Before the child's mother even realized what was happening, the man offered that same practiced smile. I'm sorry. His voice was almost gentle. I'm sorry if I startled you. The apology landed strangely. The boy hadn't said anything. He hadn't cried. He'd simply looked. The child's mother hurried over, clearly embarrassed. Eli, sweetheart, don't stare. I'm okay, the man said quickly. It's all right. Too quickly. Almost as though he were trying to rescue her from feeling uncomfortable. Alana walked over before the moment could disappear beneath everyone's politeness. She knelt beside the little boy. It's okay to be curious. The boy looked at her. Did it hurt? She nodded toward the man. You can ask him. The man blinked, surprised. The boy hesitated. Did it hurt? The man considered the question longer than expected. Yeah, he answered honestly. It did. The child looked at the scars again. Does it still? The man smiled. Some days. The answer seemed to satisfy him. The little boy nodded once, then wandered toward a table covered with puzzles, as though the mystery had been solved. Alana stood. She smiled at the man. Kids usually do better when nobody teaches them to be afraid. He looked at her for a long second. Not uncomfortable, not defensive, just caught off guard. I suppose they do. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She had the strange feeling he'd expected pity or awkward reassurance. Instead, the conversation had simply happened. Normal, human, nothing more, nothing less. The center director, Martha Green, entered carrying a folder under one arm. There you are, she called. I've been looking for you. The man turned. I hope everything's where you wanted it. It is. She smiled warmly before addressing the room. Everyone, before we get started, I just want to thank someone who'd probably rather I didn't. He shifted almost imperceptibly. Martha. It'll only take a second. She looked around at the volunteers. This renovation happened because Mercer Infrastructure chose to fund it without asking for recognition. Every new therapy station, every accessible doorway, every piece of adaptive equipment sitting in this room exists because of that gift. The room grew still. Martha continued, and the gentleman who's been setting up chairs all morning. She smiled toward him. Is Ethan Mercer. Silence arrived differently this time. Not awkward. Recognizing. Several volunteers exchanged quick glances. One quietly whispered, The Ethan Mercer? Another frowned with the faint expression of someone reaching into an old memory. Alana looked from Martha back to the man standing beside the therapy tables. She had expected almost any explanation except that one. The quiet volunteer. The man who apologized to strangers. The one who kept thanking everyone. The CEO whose name had been tied to one of Pennsylvania's most tragic industrial disasters. For the first time since she'd met him, the room wasn't looking at the scars. They were looking at the name. And somehow, after everything she had just watched, those two versions of the same man refused to fit together. Nobody rushed to Ethan. Nobody asked for a photograph. The room simply settled into an uneasy version of itself, as though everyone had suddenly remembered they were standing near someone they'd only ever known through newspaper headlines. Ethan seemed to recognize the shift before anyone else did. He thanked Martha with a polite nod. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She smiled apologetically. "But they deserve to know." "So did I." His answer wasn't sharp. It was tired. He picked up his jacket from the back of a folding chair and looked toward Alana. "It was nice meeting you." "You too." There were a dozen questions she could have asked. She asked none of them. He gave a small wave to the older stroke patient he'd helped earlier, wished everyone a good weekend, and walked toward the parking lot without waiting for another conversation. The automatic doors slid shut behind him. For a second, no one spoke. Then someone finally did. "I didn't think he'd actually come." A volunteer arranging supplies looked toward the window. "I've only ever seen pictures of him from years ago." "My husband still blames him," another woman said quietly. "One of his cousins worked on that project." Across the room, someone answered before Martha could. "The investigation never proved he cut corners." "No," the woman replied. "But people died." The sentence hung there. No one argued with it. There wasn't much to argue. People had died. That part had never been in dispute. A retired physical therapist folded her arms. "I always thought executives stayed in offices after something like that." "He doesn't." Martha closed the folder she'd been carrying. "He's visited this center 4 times since construction started." "Why?" "To see where the money was going." Someone frowned. "Couldn't someone else have done that?" He said if the company was going to help, he wanted to understand what it was helping. The room grew thoughtful. Alana stayed where she was, slowly stacking therapy cones that were already stacked. She wasn't trying to look busy. She simply needed something for her hands to do while her thoughts caught up. She remembered the man carrying heavy boxes without asking for help, thanking strangers, apologizing to a child, stepping aside so everyone else had room. None of it fit the version of Ethan Mercer she'd absorbed over the years without realizing it. She remembered headlines. She remembered photographs from long ago. A younger man with a bandaged face, leaving a courthouse. Comment sections full of certainty. People always seemed certain. Funny how certainty survived, long after facts became complicated. "You okay?" Martha's voice pulled her back. Alana looked up. "Yeah." "You've gone quiet." "I guess." She searched for the right words. "I expected someone different." "In what way?" "I don't know." She looked toward the empty entrance, where Ethan had disappeared only minutes earlier. "I've worked with enough people carrying visible injuries to recognize certain habits." Martha waited. "He apologized before anyone asked him to." Martha nodded slowly. "He does that, as if other people's discomfort belongs to him." Neither woman spoke for a few seconds. Finally, Martha sighed. "I've known Ethan for almost 10 years. And? I still haven't convinced him he doesn't have to apologize for walking into a room." That stayed with Alana longer than she expected. Across Pittsburgh, Ethan drove with the radio off. Traffic along the Allegheny moved steadily. Construction cranes stood against the skyline, reminders that the city never stopped rebuilding itself. His phone rang through the truck's speakers. Helen, his chief of staff, answered immediately. "How was the visit?" "It went well." "You stayed longer than 30 minutes. "You timed me." "I know you." A corner of Ethan's mouth lifted. "You were worried I'd leave after 10. "I would have taken 20. He glanced at the bridge ahead. "The center's doing good work." "I heard." Helen paused. "The board meeting starts in 45 minutes. I'll be there." "And Ethan..." "Yes?" "Did anyone recognize you?" He thought about the room falling quiet. "Eventually." "Was it difficult?" He considered lying. Instead, he answered honestly, "It usually is." Helen didn't offer encouragement. She knew better. Drive safely. When the call ended, the silence returned. He preferred it that way. Mercer Infrastructure occupied a renovated brick headquarters overlooking one of Pittsburgh's rivers. The building reflected Ethan's personality: practical, bright, unpretentious. No marble lobby, no oversized executive portraits. Employees greeted one another by first name as they crossed the entrance. Several nodded to Ethan without interrupting whatever conversation they were already having. "Morning, Ethan." "Morning. Good weekend?" "So far." He remembered names easily, not because it impressed people, because his father had believed forgetting names meant forgetting people. The executive conference room slowly filled. Operations reports, budget forecasts, bridge inspections, water system contracts. The agenda moved efficiently. Near the end of the meeting, Chief Financial Officer Mark Delaney cleared his throat. "One more item." Ethan looked up. "The rehabilitation center reopening." "What about it?" "The board would still like you there." "We've discussed this." "We have." Mark leaned forward. "But this is different. Our company funded the renovation." "Exactly. It would be good for employees. It would be good for the community. It would be good for you." Several executives remained carefully silent. No one wanted to pressure him. They simply wanted him back in the public eye. Ethan folded the corner of his notebook once before answering. "The story is the center." Mark nodded. "I agree. So let them have that. No reporters are asking about the company. They'll ask about me." "And?" Ethan met his eyes. "Children are learning to walk again in that building." He spoke calmly. "I won't have cameras pointed at my face when they should be pointed at them." No one argued. Not because they fully agreed, because they'd heard that answer before. The meeting continued. Outside the conference room, business moved forward. Inside Ethan's office later that afternoon, he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. For a moment, he looked at the framed photograph resting inside. Taken a week before the explosion, a younger version of himself stood beside workers on a completed bridge, smiling without thinking about how he looked. He stared for only a few seconds, then closed the drawer again. Some memories didn't become easier with time. They simply became familiar. 3 miles away, on the 8th floor of an aging newspaper building downtown, investigative journalist Rebecca Lawson spread photocopied engineering reports across a conference table. Yellow sticky notes covered nearly every page. Dates, names, questions. Her editor stepped into the room carrying 2 coffees. "Still chasing Mercer?" "I'm chasing missing information." He handed her a cup. 15-year-old stories usually stay buried for a reason. "That's what bothers me." She slid one report across the table. "Look at these inspection signatures." He frowned. "They're inconsistent." "Exactly." She reached for another document, and this revision was added 3 weeks after the explosion. So nobody can explain who authorized it." Her editor studied the paperwork. "You think Mercer hid something?" Rebecca shook her head. "I think everyone decided they understood what happened before they actually did." She tapped a blank space in the file. "There's also one engineer who resigned the day after the accident." "No interviews?" "None. No public statement. No forwarding address." The editor raised an eyebrow. "Interesting." Rebecca looked once more at Ethan Mercer's name printed across an old investigative file. "I don't know whether he's guilty." She closed the folder. "But I know this story isn't finished." Outside her office window, late afternoon sunlight settled across the Pittsburgh skyline. Elsewhere in the city, Ethan answered emails he no longer cared about. Across town, Alana found herself wondering why the quiet volunteer had looked relieved when nobody asked him questions. 3 people were thinking about the same man, for 3 completely different reasons. None of them realized their lives were already beginning to move toward the same truth. The following Saturday arrived with steady rain. It wasn't the dramatic kind that flooded streets or delayed traffic, just the sort that settled over Pittsburgh and seemed content to stay all morning. Alana pulled into the rehabilitation center parking lot a few minutes before 8. She parked beside a pickup truck she recognized. She hadn't expected to. Walking through the front entrance, she found Ethan wiping rainwater from his boots with a paper towel so he wouldn't leave footprints across the freshly cleaned floor. He noticed her. "Morning. Morning." He glanced toward the windows. "I think I brought the weather." She smiled. "I don't think you're that powerful. I was hoping you wouldn't say that." There it was again. A dry sense of humor that disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. They walked toward the supply room together. "You always get here this early?" she asked. "Usually. Even before volunteers? I like having a few quiet minutes." "I can understand that." He looked at her. "Can you?" She nodded. "When I worked in acute rehab, I'd sit in my car for 5 minutes before every shift." "Why?" "So I could leave whatever was happening in my own life outside before I walked in." He considered that. Did it work? Not always. That earned a small laugh from him. Not loud, not forced. Real. It surprised both of them. The morning filled with familiar routines. Coffee brewed. Patients drifted in. A retired firefighter proudly announced he'd managed to button his own dress shirt for the first time since his stroke. Everyone applauded, not because buttoning a shirt was extraordinary, because everyone in the room understood what it had cost him. Ethan applauded too. His smile lingered a little longer than usual. Alana caught him watching the firefighter shake his wife's hand instead of hugging her. There was something knowing in Ethan's expression, not pity, recognition. Later, while volunteers prepared materials for an adaptive gardening activity, Ethan picked up a small tray of tomato seedlings. "You grow vegetables?" Alana asked. "A little." "What kind?" "Tomatoes, peppers, basil." She raised an eyebrow. "That's surprisingly ordinary." "I've always found ordinary underrated." She laughed. "My grandmother would have liked that answer." What would she have said? That tomatoes taste better when somebody grows them because they actually want to eat them. He smiled. "Your grandmother sounds wise." She'd say she was stubborn. "What about you?" "I'm still deciding." He looked down at the seedlings. "I think you've inherited both." She blinked. "That's a confident assessment for someone who's known me about a week." "I've been watching." The words came out before he could soften them. He looked almost uncomfortable. "I mean, the way you work." "I know what you meant." For the first time, they both looked away at the same moment. Neither understood why that brief exchange suddenly felt more personal than talking about injuries or work ever had. Just before lunch, one of the center's regular participants, 73-year-old Frank Donnelly, struggled with the zipper on his winter jacket. His right hand still lacked enough strength to grip properly. "I've got it," Frank muttered, frustrated. The zipper slipped again. Without drawing attention to himself, Ethan crouched beside him. "Mind if I hold the fabric?" "I don't need anyone dressing me." "I know." Ethan's tone never changed. "I was hoping you'd let me steady the jacket while you beat the zipper yourself." Frank looked at him for a second, then handed over one corner. Together, they worked the zipper into place. Frank pulled it up on his own. "There." Ethan stood. "Told you you'd beat it." Frank grinned despite himself. "You cheated." "A little. You only held the jacket." "I know." Frank shook his head. "You've got an annoying amount of patience." "My sister says the same thing." Alana had watched the whole exchange from across the room. What struck her wasn't that Ethan helped. It was how carefully he avoided taking the victory away from Frank. He hadn't solved the problem. He'd made sure Frank solved it himself. Most people thought helping meant doing something for another person. Therapists learned early that real help often meant stepping back at exactly the right moment. Without realizing it, Ethan had done precisely that. The afternoon slowed. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Several patients gathered around card tables. Others talked over coffee. The room carried the comfortable noise of people who no longer felt like strangers. Alana found Ethan rinsing mugs in the small kitchenette. "You don't have to wash those." "I used one." "There are volunteers assigned to clean up." "I know." She leaned against the counter. "You always try to leave places better than you found them?" He shrugged. "I guess." That's a habit. So is noticing other people's habits. He wasn't wrong. She smiled. Occupational hazard. He dried the last mug with a dish towel. What did you notice? She thought for a moment. You never walk into a room expecting anyone to make space for you. His hands stopped moving. You always make space for everyone else. He folded the towel carefully. I've had practice. There was no bitterness in the answer, only fact. She could have asked what he meant. She didn't. Instead, she nodded once. So have I. He looked at her again, not because she'd explained herself, because she hadn't. Some experiences didn't require details, only recognition. The following Saturday became the next one, then another. Without either of them discussing it, they began expecting the other's presence. If Ethan arrived first, he automatically started a second cup of coffee. If Alana reached the center before him, she'd leave a tray of seedlings or puzzle pieces on the work table he usually organized. None of it felt like flirting. It felt easier than that. Safer. Their conversations wandered wherever they happened to land. Favorite neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. The best bakery in the Strip District. Whether coffee tasted better at home than in cafes. Why basil somehow grew faster than everything else in Ethan's garden. He never talked about board meetings. She never asked about business. She spoke about patients without violating their privacy. He spoke about construction projects without mentioning contracts or money. They built a friendship almost entirely out of ordinary things. And somehow, those ordinary things became the part of Ethan's week he looked forward to most. Claire Mercer noticed before he did. She stopped by his house one Sunday afternoon, carrying homemade soup their mother insisted he take. You've started buying fresh flowers. Ethan looked toward the kitchen table. They were on sale. They were. She smiled. You've also started smiling before answering the phone. I smile, not at voicemail. He laughed. I don't know what you're talking about. You've been leaving the house on Saturdays even when you don't have inspections. I volunteer. I know. Claire studied him for a moment. You like someone. He nearly choked on his coffee. No. No? I didn't say that convincingly, did I? She grinned. Not even a little. He looked out toward the small vegetable garden behind the house. Rain had left droplets clinging to the tomato plants. It's not like that. What is it like? He took longer to answer than the question probably deserved. It's peaceful. Claire didn't tease him. She simply nodded. I haven't heard you use that word in years. Across town, Alana was having a similar conversation with her mother over Sunday dinner. You've mentioned the rehabilitation center volunteer 3 times tonight. I have not. You have. Her mother smiled into her tea. The man with the garden, that narrows it down to about half of Pittsburgh. The quiet one. Alana laughed. He's interesting. In what way? He listens. That's rare. He never tries to impress anyone. And? Alana reached for another piece of cornbread. And I can't figure him out. Her mother raised an eyebrow. Maybe that's because you're trying to. Alana didn't answer. Maybe she was. Late Monday afternoon, several floors above downtown Pittsburgh, Rebecca Lawson sat inside the state archives reviewing boxes that hadn't been opened in years. Most contained routine engineering paperwork, inspection schedules, material invoices, safety certifications. Then she found something different. A handwritten request for access to technical documents that had been sealed shortly after the explosion. Attached to it was a note, access denied pending legal review. The signature underneath belonged to someone no longer employed by the state. Rebecca stared at the page. If someone had fought to keep certain records sealed 15 years ago, the question wasn't simply what they were hiding. It was why they believed those records still mattered now. She closed the file slowly. Outside, evening settled over the city. Neither Ethan nor Alana knew another Saturday was coming. Neither realized someone else, miles away, had just taken the first real step toward uncovering the truth Ethan had spent 15 years carrying alone. By the time spring settled over Pittsburgh, nobody at the rehabilitation center seemed surprised to see Ethan arrive before 8. He still parked in the same corner of the lot. He still carried his own coffee. He still found something useful to do before anyone asked. The difference was that people had stopped watching him the moment he walked through the door. It wasn't acceptance exactly. It was familiarity. For Ethan, that was close enough. One Saturday morning, Alana found him outside adjusting one of the raised garden beds the center had installed after the renovation. A wooden corner had shifted slightly. "It'll bother you all morning if you leave it like that, won't it?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder. "It already has." She laughed. "I figured." He tightened the last screw and stood. "There. Better? Not perfect, but better." She nodded toward the beds. "You know these patients are going to grow more weeds than vegetables." "I've seen my own garden, so you know." "I know." They carried trays of seedlings toward the patio together. Neither hurried to fill the silence. That had become one of the easier things between them. During the morning session, several patients worked on planting herbs using adaptive gardening tools. An elderly woman named Mrs. Alvarez struggled to scoop enough soil into a planter without spilling most of it onto the table. She sighed. "My hands don't listen anymore." "They're listening," Alana said. "They're just speaking more slowly now." Mrs. Alvarez smiled despite herself. Ethan stood nearby, watching without interrupting. When the woman finally managed to settle a basil plant into the soil, she looked up proudly. "I did that." "You did," Alana agreed. Ethan nodded. "And you didn't let the plant argue with you." Mrs. Alvarez laughed. "It tried." "I could tell." The room laughed with her. The moment passed quickly, but Alana noticed Ethan never reached for the planter. He'd let the woman finish in her own time. After the session ended, they carried empty trays back inside. "You would have made a decent therapist," she said. He looked genuinely confused. "I would have?" "You don't rush people." "I spend my days around engineers." "So?" "They remind me often that I move too slowly." She smiled. "Patients would disagree." He shrugged. "I've never liked taking something away from people they can still do themselves." She looked at him. "Why?" He took longer to answer than the question seemed to require. "My father believed helping someone isn't the same as replacing them." "Sounds like a smart man." He usually was. He looked toward the garden, where Mrs. Alvarez was proudly showing her basil plant to another participant. "I think people deserve the satisfaction of finishing their own victories." Alana said nothing. She simply tucked that sentence away. Their conversations rarely stayed on one subject for long. One week they debated whether Pittsburgh had the best bakeries in Pennsylvania. The next, they argued over whether tomato sandwiches needed mayonnaise. "You can't eat one dry," Ethan insisted. "I can. You shouldn't." She laughed. "That's a strong opinion." "It's the correct one." "You sound very confident." "I've had years of research." "You mean lunches?" "I mean research." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Neither remembered who won. Both remembered laughing. The friendship settled into something neither of them tried to define. If Ethan noticed a patient looking discouraged, Alana often found him sitting nearby a few minutes later, talking about baseball, weather, gardening, anything except the injury itself. If Alana spent too long with one family helping through a difficult afternoon, she sometimes returned to find a fresh cup of coffee waiting on the break room counter. Nobody announced who had left it. She already knew. The gestures stayed small. That was what made them matter. Claire Mercer noticed the difference before Ethan admitted there was one. She stopped by his office late Tuesday afternoon carrying folders from a family foundation meeting. "You've declined exactly one dinner invitation this month." Ethan looked up from a bridge inspection report. "Is that unusual?" "For you?" She sat across from his desk. "Extremely. I've been busy." Claire smiled. "You've also started leaving work before 7. "I still answer emails." "I know." She folded her hands. "But you're living between them now." He leaned back in his chair. "What does that mean?" "It means you're remembering there's a world outside this building." He looked through the office window toward workers crossing the parking lot. "I've been volunteering." "I know. You keep saying that." Because it's true. She stood to leave. I'm glad you found somewhere nobody expects you to be the CEO. After she left, Ethan stared at the closed door for several seconds. He hadn't realized that was exactly why the rehabilitation center felt different. No contracts, no negotiations, no expectations. Just people trying to regain pieces of ordinary life. Somehow, he fit there. Helen Foster noticed it too. The following week, she stepped into Ethan's office holding a stack of correspondence. You've accepted the Regional Safety Council luncheon. He signed one document without looking up. I did. You've declined it every year. I know. You also agreed to visit the apprenticeship program next month. He finally looked at her. They invited me. They've invited you every year. He smiled faintly. I suppose they have. Helen studied him for a moment. I don't need details. There aren't any. I wasn't asking. She placed the folders on his desk. I only wanted to say. She hesitated. It's good to see you saying yes to things again. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the framed photograph hidden inside the bottom drawer of his desk. He didn't open it. For once, he didn't feel the need to. Saturday arrived again. Near the end of the volunteer shift, Frank Donnelly caught Ethan by the coffee station. My granddaughter's graduating from nursing school next month. That's wonderful. You ever get tired of people showing you family pictures? Ethan smiled. Never. Frank pulled out his phone and proudly displayed 3 photographs. Ethan looked at every one of them, not with polite interest, with genuine attention. When Frank wandered away, Alana walked over. You know. She stirred sugar into her coffee. Most people would have glanced at the first picture and called it good. I like seeing people proud of someone. You mean that? I do. She leaned against the counter. Can I ask you something? You can. You're surrounded by billion-dollar projects every day. He laughed softly. Not every day. Close enough. What about them? You seem happier talking to Frank about his granddaughter than discussing contracts. He looked toward the activity room, where several patients were packing up. The contracts keep bridges standing. And? They're important. She waited. He watched Mrs. Alvarez carefully carrying her basil plant toward the exit. Then he answered, but people remember who stood beside them when something difficult finally became possible. The sentence lingered between them. Neither added anything to it. Sometimes conversations ended naturally because there was nowhere better to take them. As volunteers began stacking chairs, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He wasn't thinking about getting home. He was already wondering what he and Alana might talk about next Saturday. The closer the calendar moved toward late September, the more often Ethan found old memories returning without invitation. He never marked the anniversary on his calendar. He didn't need to. His body remembered before the date did. He slept a little less. Coffee grew cold beside his laptop more often. He read every safety report twice. At Mercer Infrastructure, employees noticed only that their CEO became quieter during one particular week each year. Most assumed he was focused on work. Only Helen knew better. The rehabilitation center noticed the anniversary too. A television mounted in the waiting area quietly played the local morning news while volunteers prepared coffee. The anchor's voice drifted across the room. 15 years since the Mercer Infrastructure explosion that claimed 7 lives. Nobody stopped what they were doing, but almost everyone listened. A short segment followed. Old aerial footage, emergency vehicles, archived photographs. A younger Ethan leaving the hospital surrounded by reporters. The scars were still hidden beneath bandages then. The report ended the way it always seemed to. Questions, opinions, old interviews from grieving families. The anchor moved on to the weather. The room didn't. One volunteer shook her head. I still remember watching that on television. So do I, another replied. My brother worked construction back then. Someone else spoke up. I never understood how Mercer kept his company after that. It helps when you're rich. Maybe, maybe not. The comments weren't loud. No one sounded angry. It was something more familiar than that. People repeating a story they'd heard for years. Alana continued arranging therapy cards without joining the conversation. She wasn't avoiding it. She simply didn't have anything to add. One volunteer looked toward her. "You've spent more time around him than most of us." Alana glanced up. "So? You think he's a good guy?" She considered the question. "I think I know how he behaves here." "That's not what I asked." "No." She placed another stack of cards on the shelf. "It isn't." The volunteer waited. "So?" Alana smiled politely. "I don't know enough to answer the question you're asking." The woman frowned. "You don't have an opinion?" "I have observations." "Same thing." "They're not." Before anyone could continue, Martha entered carrying attendance sheets. "Morning, everyone." The conversation dissolved into routine. Attendance, coffee, patients arriving. The debate ended without anyone changing anyone else's mind. Alana preferred it that way. Later that morning, Ethan arrived carrying 2 small boxes. "What are those?" Martha asked. "Adaptive kitchen tools." She looked inside. "These weren't on our request list." "I know. We can't keep letting you do this." "You aren't." He smiled. "The company made a donation. I stopped by a medical supply store." Martha sighed. "You'll spoil us." "I doubt that." He carried the boxes toward the therapy room before anyone could thank him again. Across the room, Alana noticed 2 volunteers lower their voices as he passed. She couldn't hear every word, only fragments. "Hard to forget. Oh. Families. I still don't know." Ethan never looked their way. Whether he hadn't heard them, or had simply learned not to react, she couldn't tell. He unpacked the kitchen tools exactly as he'd unpacked every other donation, carefully, methodically, without expecting acknowledgement. That afternoon, after the patients had gone home, Alana found him replacing worn tennis balls on the bottoms of several walkers. You know someone else would have done that tomorrow. They were here today. She knelt beside the walker he was working on. "You don't seem bothered." "About what?" "The conversations." He slid a fresh tennis ball onto one leg. "People are allowed to have opinions." "Even when they're wrong?" He looked at her for a moment. "They're allowed." She searched his face. "Doesn't it ever make you angry?" He stood slowly. "I've spent enough years wishing people would think differently." "And?" "It doesn't change anything." His answer wasn't defensive. It sounded practiced, like something repeated often enough to become part of daily life. Before she could respond, Frank called from across the room. "Ethan!" "I'm coming." He walked away. The conversation ended, unfinished. Somehow that made it stay with her longer. Across town, Rebecca Lawson pulled into a quiet neighborhood north of Pittsburgh. A retired state safety inspector named Harold Benson opened the front door before she reached the porch. "You must be the reporter. I appreciate your time." "I've got coffee." "Then I definitely appreciate your time." Harold laughed. His home was modest. Family photographs lined the mantel. Fishing trophies occupied one shelf. Nothing about the room suggested a man who had once investigated some of Pennsylvania's largest industrial accidents. Rebecca set her recorder on the table. "You inspected the Mercer explosion." "I did." "What do you remember?" Harold leaned back. "The smell." She looked surprised. "The smell?" "You don't forget burned concrete." He folded his hands. "What else?" "The workers. The families." The silence afterward. Rebecca waited. "I've read the official report." "So have I. It concludes leadership failures contributed to the accident." Harold nodded once. "It does." "You don't sound convinced." He smiled faintly. "You're asking 2 different questions." She leaned forward. "Explain." "The report says what investigators could prove." "And?" "That isn't always the same as everything investigators suspect." Rebecca held his gaze. "Was Ethan Mercer lying?" Harold shook his head immediately. "I never thought he lied." "Then what?" The older man stood and walked toward a filing cabinet near the window. He hesitated before opening it. "I always thought—" He stopped himself. Rebecca didn't interrupt. "That somebody else knew more than they admitted." She frowned. Who? I never figured that out. He pulled out a thin folder. There was one young engineer. Rebecca's pulse quickened. No interviews after the explosion. No public statement. Then he disappeared. Harold placed the folder on the table. I asked about him more than once. What happened? My supervisor told me not to waste time chasing people who'd already resigned. Rebecca looked down at the name typed across one faded page. Daniel Reeves. She had seen it before. Only this time it wasn't buried inside hundreds of documents. Now it stood alone, like the first loose thread in a sweater someone had spent 15 years trying not to unravel. That Saturday ended the way most Saturdays did. Volunteers folded tables. Patients headed home. Coffee pots were emptied. Outside, Ethan stood beside his truck, searching his pockets. You lose something? Alana asked. My keys. They're in your left hand. He looked down. They are. She smiled. You've had a long day. So it would seem. He slipped the keys into his jacket pocket. For a second, neither reached for the driver's door. The parking lot had almost emptied. You coming next week? She asked. If you'll have me. The words were simple, but there was something careful about them, as though, even after months of volunteering there, a part of him still believed he might one day be asked not to return. Alana answered without hesitation. I don't think it's my decision. No, it isn't. She smiled. But I'd notice if you weren't here. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded once. I'll see you next Saturday. As he drove away, he caught himself looking in the rearview mirror, not at the road behind him, at the rehabilitation center, growing smaller in the distance. It had become the one place in Pittsburgh where people slowly got stronger. He hadn't expected to become one of them. By early October, Saturday mornings no longer felt like separate visits. They felt like a rhythm. Ethan arrived first, more often than not. Alana usually followed a few minutes later. Neither commented on it. They simply started wherever the day needed them. That afternoon, after the last patient had left, Martha stopped by the supply room. You two don't have to stay. We're almost finished, Alana said. Martha smiled. I know. That's what you always say. She grabbed her coat. Lock up when you're done. The front door closed behind her. For the first time since Ethan had begun volunteering, the building fell completely silent. Only the faint hum of the heating system remained. Alana carried a stack of therapy mats toward the storage room. You don't have to help. I know. He reached for the top half of the stack anyway. You figured out I don't listen very well. I figured that out weeks ago. He smiled. So did I. They finished putting supplies away in a few minutes. Neither seemed eager to leave. Outside, dusk settled over Pittsburgh. Rain tapped softly against the windows again. You want coffee? Alana asked. The machine still works? Barely. I'll take my chances. The coffee wasn't very good. Neither of them pretended otherwise. They sat across from each other at one of the folding tables patients usually used for group activities. The room felt strangely different without anyone else in it. Not uncomfortable, just honest. Alana wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup. You've been quieter these past couple of weeks. Ethan looked at the coffee instead of her. Have the first? You know you have. He let out a slow breath. This time of year always gets to me. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Not the details. The date. The anniversary had been impossible to avoid. Newspaper articles, television segments, people talking in lowered voices when they thought he wasn't listening. She waited. He appreciated that. Most people rushed to fill silence. She seemed willing to let it do its own work. After a while he spoke. I used to think time would make certain things smaller. And it doesn't. His thumb traced the edge of the paper cup. It only teaches you how to carry them. She nodded once. I've seen that. He glanced up. With patience? With people. The room grew quiet again. Outside, headlights moved across the rain-dark parking lot. Finally, Ethan spoke before he could change his mind. I was there. Alana met his eyes. I know. No. He shook his head gently. I don't mean my name was attached to it. He paused. I mean, I was standing there. She didn't interrupt. I still remember the sound. He swallowed. Not the explosion itself. The second before. He stared past her for a moment. There was this pressure. He searched for words that never seemed quite right. The kind you feel in your ears before a storm. His voice remained calm, almost too calm. Then everything happened at once. He stopped. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt respected. I don't remember getting to the hospital. The first clear memory I have. He looked down at his left hand. Was realizing people were trying very hard not to react when they looked at me. Alana noticed he hadn't once mentioned the pain, not the surgeries, not rehabilitation, only people. She understood more from that than she would have from a detailed description of burns. I thought that part would get easier. He smiled without humor. It didn't. You mean the scars? I mean, watching other people try to pretend they don't see them. His eyes drifted toward the window. After enough years, you start helping them. Helping them? You stand with your good side facing the room. He gave a faint shrug. You apologize before they can. Alana felt something tighten in her chest. Not pity, recognition. She had watched him do exactly that on the first day they'd met. He wasn't describing a strategy. He was describing a habit, one he'd probably stopped noticing years ago. You know. She said softly. I've never once been uncomfortable around your scars. He looked surprised. I've been curious. That's different. It is. She smiled. My patients taught me something. What? The body always tells the truth before people do. He frowned slightly. I'm not sure I understand. I watch hands. She lifted one of her own. Shoulders. The way someone reaches for a doorknob. The way they sit down. She looked at him steadily. You've never acted like someone trying to frighten people. You act like someone trying not to burden them. He looked away first. No one had ever said it that plainly. Not Helen, not Claire, not therapists, not doctors. He didn't know what to do with the sentence, so he left it alone. After another long pause, he spoke again. There were families. She nodded. I know. I still think about them. Every day? Most. His voice lowered. I signed letters, attended funerals, met children who were too young to understand why their fathers weren't coming home. He rubbed his thumb against the paper cup again. I was responsible for the company. So. Well, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Alana heard the rest anyway. Responsible. Therefore guilty. She let the thought settle between them instead of arguing with it. Then she asked the only question that seemed worth asking. When was the last time you talked about this? He gave a quiet laugh. I think I'm doing it now. Not to lawyers. Not to reporters. To another person. He searched his memory. I honestly don't know. The admission seemed to surprise him. He looked exhausted afterward, not because speaking had been difficult, because he'd spent 15 years making sure he never had to. Alana reached for her coat, but didn't stand. There is something I don't understand. He nodded. Okay. She chose her words carefully, not because she wanted to protect him, because she wanted to be accurate. What makes you believe surviving means you stop deserving a life? The question landed without force. It didn't accuse. It didn't comfort. It simply waited. Ethan stared at her. For several seconds he didn't blink, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. He opened his mouth once, closed it again. He looked toward the empty therapy room where patients had spent the morning celebrating tiny victories, then back at his untouched coffee. He searched for an answer the way an engineer searched for a missing calculation, patiently, methodically. There wasn't one. Not one he believed. Not one he could say aloud. The word faded before it became a sentence. For the first time in 15 years, Ethan Mercer realized he had built an entire life around an idea he had never actually questioned. Neither of them spoke again. They threw away their cold coffee, switched off the lights, and walked into the cool evening air. At the parking lot, they exchanged the same simple goodbye they always did. "Drive safely." "You too." Nothing dramatic happened. No promises, no lingering embrace. Yet as Ethan drove home through the quiet streets along the Allegheny River, Alana's question stayed in the truck with him. He carried it into his driveway, into the empty kitchen, onto the back porch where his coffee slowly cooled beside him. Long after darkness settled over the river, he was still sitting there, not thinking about the explosion, not thinking about the headlines, only wondering why he had never once asked himself the question that one woman had asked in less than 10 words. And for the first time in many years, silence no longer felt like somewhere he could hide. The first envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. Rebecca Lawson almost threw it into the pile of routine mail. There was no return address, only her name, typed neatly across the front. Inside was a single photocopied page from an engineering review she'd never seen before. One sentence had been highlighted. "Final calibration postponed pending authorization." Someone had written one question beside it, in blue ink. Who approved removing this page? Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Rebecca read it twice before walking to the whiteboard covering one wall of her office. For nearly 2 years she had filled it with names, dates, timelines, and unanswered questions surrounding the Mercer infrastructure explosion. She pinned the page beside 3 others. The sentence didn't solve anything. It made everything harder, because now she knew there had once been another version of the file. Someone had changed it. She simply didn't know who. 3 days later, she sat across from a record supervisor inside a state archive building. "I've requested every revision log connected to the Mercer investigation." The supervisor adjusted his glasses. "I've looked. And they don't exist. They had to exist. They should." Rebecca leaned forward. "So where did they go?" The man spread his hands. "I honestly don't know." She believed him. That was the frustrating part. He wasn't protecting anyone. He simply had nothing left to give her. As she packed her notebook, one thought refused to leave. People didn't erase paperwork by accident. Hundreds of miles away, Daniel Reeves stood in the break room of a small manufacturing plant outside Columbus, Ohio. His coffee sat untouched beside the sink. Someone had left the morning newspaper folded open on the table. A headline near the bottom caught his attention. "Reporter revisits unsolved questions in Mercer explosion." His stomach tightened before he even finished reading. The article didn't mention him. It didn't mention skipped calibrations. It didn't suggest a hidden engineer. It simply announced that investigative reporter Rebecca Lawson was preparing a long-form series examining industrial accidents that still raised unanswered questions. Daniel folded the newspaper carefully. Too carefully. One of his co-workers walked in. "You okay?" Daniel forced a nod. "Didn't sleep much." His co-worker accepted the explanation without another question. Daniel wished he could. That evening, he drove home later than usual. His wife, Emily, was helping their teenage daughter with algebra at the dining room table. Their son was in the living room, arguing with a basketball game on television. It looked ordinary, comfortably ordinary. 15 years earlier, Ethan Mercer had protected this life before it even existed. Daniel looked at his family and felt the familiar weight settle across his shoulders. Emily noticed immediately. "You've been somewhere else all week." "I'm fine." "You always say that." She waited. He didn't continue. After dinner, he stepped onto the back porch alone. The October air carried the first hint of winter. He reached into his wallet. Hidden behind his driver's license was an old newspaper clipping, not of the explosion, of Ethan. The article was nearly 15 years old. The photograph showed Ethan leaving a courthouse, with fresh scars and cameras pointed toward him from every direction. Daniel had carried that clipping through 3 moves, 2 different jobs, an entire lifetime. He had never thrown it away, because every time he considered it, he remembered the sentence Ethan had spoken in a hospital room. "Take care of your family." Nothing more. No anger. No accusations. Daniel closed his eyes. The silence that had once felt like mercy no longer did. It felt borrowed. Back in Pittsburgh, life continued moving in smaller ways. Saturday arrived. Alana was arranging adaptive kitchen stations when Ethan walked in carrying a paper bag. "You brought breakfast." "I brought muffins." She looked inside. Blueberry. The bakery was out of cinnamon. "I'll forgive them." "So will I." Frank wandered over a few minutes later. "I heard there were muffins." "There were." "Were?" Ethan smiled. "You're late." Frank looked offended. "I've been retired for 12 years. "Exactly." The three of them laughed. It was the kind of moment that disappeared almost as quickly as it happened. Still, Alana noticed something. Ethan laughed more easily now. Not often, but often enough that she noticed the difference. During the afternoon therapy session, a young burn survivor named Natalie struggled through an exercise involving fine motor coordination. Halfway through, she dropped every clothespin she'd been trying to clip onto a board. Plastic scattered across the floor. "I can't do this." She pushed the chair back. "I'm done." Nobody rushed toward her. Alana had learned that frustration needed room before encouragement meant anything. Ethan slowly knelt beside the scattered clothespins. He picked up one, then another. He placed them back on the table. Nothing more. Natalie watched him. "You don't have to." "I know." He sat back down in the chair beside her. "I've started over before." She glanced toward his scars. He didn't mention them. Neither did she. After a long pause, Natalie picked up another clothespin. "I hate this." "I believe you." She tried again. This time, the clip stayed in place. Only one. But one was enough. Alana looked across the room. Ethan caught her eye for a second. Neither smiled. They didn't need to. Some victories belonged entirely to the person who earned them. That evening, Claire stopped by Ethan's house without calling first. She found him watering tomato plants that had long since stopped producing fruit. "You know the season's over." "I know. So, why are you watering empty plants?" He looked down at the garden. "Habit." Claire folded her arms. "Or maybe you don't like letting go." He laughed under his breath. "You've been talking to Mom." "No." "I've been watching my brother." She walked beside him toward the porch. "You look lighter." "I don't feel lighter." "Not yet." She nudged his shoulder gently. "But you're looking up more." He didn't argue. Because she was right. He simply hadn't noticed. Late Sunday night, Rebecca pinned one final note onto her investigation board. Every arrow pointed back toward the same unanswered space. Missing engineer. She stepped back. For nearly 2 years, she had believed Ethan Mercer was the center of the story. Now she wasn't so sure. Somewhere, someone else had walked away from that explosion carrying information no official report had ever fully explained. She simply had no idea where to find him. More than 300 miles away, Daniel Reeves stared at the same newspaper article lying open on his kitchen table. One woman was trying to uncover the truth. One man had spent 15 years protecting it, and another had spent 15 years hiding from both. Daniel Reeves didn't tell his family he was taking a personal day. He left before sunrise, packed an overnight bag into the trunk, and drove east toward Pittsburgh. The interstate looked almost exactly as he remembered. The same rolling hills, the same rest stops, the same feeling in his chest every mile closer he got. 15 years had passed. The road hadn't changed nearly as much as he had. He arrived just after noon. Instead of driving into the city, he parked in a quiet lot overlooking one of Mercer Infrastructure's active bridge projects. Workers in bright safety vests moved across the structure with practiced rhythm. Every few minutes, someone stopped to review a checklist before continuing. Daniel noticed the safety boards first. Large signs at every entrance. Mandatory equipment inspections. Daily calibration logs. Every crew paused before beginning work. Nothing happened without documentation. He closed his eyes. This wasn't the company he'd left behind. It was the company Ethan had rebuilt, not to repair a reputation, to make certain another family never received the phone call his mistakes had created. A construction superintendent walked past his truck, talking into a radio. "Safety review starts in 5. Daniel looked away. That sentence alone carried 15 years of consequences. He hadn't planned to see Ethan. That changed when he noticed a familiar pickup truck pulling onto the site. Ethan climbed out wearing a reflective jacket and a hard hat tucked beneath one arm. He looked older. His hair carried more gray than Daniel remembered. The scars were visible now. So was something else. The workers greeted him without hesitation. One equipment operator walked over, holding a tablet. Another pointed toward a section of steel supports. Ethan listened, asked questions, then walked the length of the bridge with them instead of standing apart. No cameras, no executives following him. Just another morning making sure people went home safely. Daniel stayed inside his truck, watching, waiting, trying to understand how the man he'd ruined had somehow spent 15 years protecting everyone except himself. He followed at a distance when Ethan left the site that afternoon. Not because he wanted to confront him, because he couldn't make himself drive back to Ohio without trying. Ethan's final stop surprised him. The rehabilitation center. Daniel parked across the street. Through the front windows, he watched volunteers carrying folding tables toward a storage room. Then he saw Alana. She handed Ethan a stack of clipboards. He said something Daniel couldn't hear. She laughed. Not loudly, comfortably. Ethan laughed too. It lasted barely 2 seconds. Daniel stared. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen Ethan laugh. Maybe before the explosion. Maybe never afterward. The realization hurt in a way he hadn't expected. One ordinary conversation had given Ethan something Daniel's silence never could. A place where he wasn't only the man from the headlines. He almost drove away. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment and found an old business card Ethan had given him years ago. The office number no longer existed. The email address probably didn't either. On the back, Daniel wrote 4 words. "We need to talk." He sat with the card in his hand for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, he walked across the street. Inside the center, most volunteers had already left. Martha looked up from the reception desk. "Can I help you?" Daniel glanced toward the hallway, where Ethan's voice drifted from another room. "I'm looking for Ethan Mercer." "May I tell him who's here?" Daniel hesitated. The lie reached his lips first, then stopped. "My name is Daniel Reeves." Martha noticed nothing unusual. "I'll let him know." She disappeared down the hallway. Daniel considered walking back out. His legs refused. Ethan stepped into the lobby less than a minute later. The moment their eyes met, neither man spoke. Daniel had rehearsed this conversation for years. Every version vanished. Ethan stood completely still. Not angry, not surprised, just looking. "You came a long way," Ethan said at last. Daniel nodded. "I almost turned around 3 times. "I figured." Neither moved. Martha quietly excused herself, sensing this wasn't a conversation that needed witnesses. When the lobby emptied, Ethan gestured toward 2 chairs near the window. "Sit." Daniel remained standing. "I don't think I deserve to." Ethan looked at him for a second. "Then stand." The silence stretched between them. Daniel finally spoke. "I saw the news." "I assumed you would. The investigation." "I know." Daniel rubbed both hands together. "I should have come years ago. Probably. I kept telling myself your life had moved on." Ethan didn't answer, because they both knew it hadn't. Daniel swallowed hard. "I watched you today." "At the bridge?" Ethan nodded once. "You saw the safety briefings?" "I saw everything." His voice cracked. "You built an entire company around what I did." "No." Ethan's reply came gently. "I built it around making sure it never happened again." Daniel lowered his head. "I took everything from you." Ethan looked out the window. Cars passed steadily along the street. People walked home from work without knowing what conversation was unfolding a few feet away. "My face isn't why my life changed." Daniel looked up. "The families." Ethan's voice remained steady. "They trusted us." I know." The second time Daniel said it, the words barely came out. Tears gathered before he could stop them. "I've lived every day wondering when someone would knock on my door." "You had children to raise." "You raised them for me." Ethan frowned. "I did no such thing." You protected them. Daniel covered his face with both hands. My wife survived because she kept her insurance. My son grew up with his father. My daughter thinks I'm a decent man. His shoulders shook. They're living the life you gave them. For the first time since the conversation began, Ethan leaned forward. Daniel, I'm sorry. I know. Daniel looked at him through tears. You don't. I've never stopped being sorry. Ethan nodded slowly. I believe you. Neither man spoke for nearly a minute. The room held no anger, only exhaustion. 15 years of it. Finally, Daniel whispered the question that had brought him back to Pittsburgh. Do you regret it? Ethan understood immediately. The decision, the silence, the sacrifice. He looked at the floor before answering. I regret that people died. Daniel closed his eyes. I regret every morning they woke up without someone they loved. His voice softened. But protecting your family? He shook his head once. No. Daniel stared at him in disbelief. I've hated myself for 15 years. I know. And you? Ethan interrupted quietly. I've never wanted your children to inherit your worst mistake. Daniel broke completely then, not with loud sobs, not with dramatic apologies. He simply lowered his head into his hands and cried the way exhausted people sometimes do when they've carried something for far too long. Ethan didn't move to comfort him. He didn't tell him everything would be okay. Some grief couldn't be shortened by kindness. He simply stayed. Sometimes that was the only thing another person could honestly offer. Outside the rehabilitation center, evening settled across Pittsburgh. Inside, two men sat in silence. One had carried the blame. The other had carried the truth. Neither left that room feeling forgiven. But for the first time in 15 years, neither man was carrying the weight alone. The Monday after Daniel returned to Ohio, Ethan arrived at the office before sunrise. The building was still dark. Cleaning crews moved quietly through the hallways while he unlocked his office. His inbox already held more than 80 emails, contract revisions, budget approvals, a bridge inspection report. One message, however, sat at the top with the subject line, Interview Request, Rebecca Lawson. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked out the window at the city waking below him. Then he deleted nothing. He simply marked it unread and continued with the rest of his morning. By mid-morning, Helen stepped into his office carrying a legal folder. You've seen it. I have. She closed the door behind her. Are you planning to respond? No. You usually at least decline. This time I think silence says the same thing. Helen sat across from his desk. I've read some of her work. So have I. She isn't sensational. I know. She asks difficult questions. He looked at her. That's exactly why I won't do it. Helen didn't argue. She had worked beside Ethan long enough to recognize the difference between a decision and a wall. This was the second one. Across town, Rebecca stared at the brief reply that finally arrived later that afternoon. Ms. Lawson, thank you for your request. I won't be participating in an interview. I wish you the best with your reporting. Ethan Mercer. She read it twice. No irritation, no legal threats, no attempt to influence her work, just a refusal. Her editor leaned against the doorway. That's a no? She nodded. What do you think? Rebecca closed her laptop. I think he's protecting something. You still believe he's hiding the truth? She thought carefully before answering. I don't know if he's hiding the truth. She looked toward the investigation board covered in notes. I think he's hiding someone. Saturday arrived with bright autumn sunlight. The rehabilitation center felt busier than usual. Families filled the waiting area. Volunteers prepared for a community open house scheduled a few weeks away. Ethan was replacing batteries in adaptive communication devices when Alana walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. I guessed. You guessed correctly. She handed him one. You've been thinking. He smiled faintly. Is it that obvious? You've read the same page 3 times. He looked down at the instruction manual still open in front of him. I have. You also tightened one screw that was already tight. He laughed softly. I did. She leaned against the work table. You don't have to tell me. I know, but you can. He looked around the room. Patients were beginning to arrive. Volunteers greeted them. No one paid attention to the two of them standing near the window. There are things from 15 years ago. He stopped. She waited. Oh, that still belonged to other people. She nodded slowly. I figured. He looked surprised. You did? I've never thought you were hiding something to protect yourself. What made you think that? She smiled. The first day we met. He frowned slightly. You apologized to a little boy for looking at you. I remember. People who spend their lives protecting themselves don't usually apologize for making strangers uncomfortable. The words settled quietly between them. I don't know what happened, she continued, and I'm not asking you to tell me. He looked at her carefully. I only know that every difficult subject seems to make you worry about someone besides yourself. He lowered his eyes. She had noticed. Of course she had. The morning passed quickly. A new participant named Marcus arrived for his first group session after losing partial mobility in his right arm during a workplace accident. He refused every offer of help. I'm fine. You don't need to carry that by yourself, a volunteer said. I'm fine. He wasn't. The frustration showed in every movement. When he dropped a stack of therapy blocks onto the floor, he muttered something under his breath and turned away before anyone could see his face. Ethan bent down and gathered the blocks without speaking. Marcus sighed. I said I was fine. I heard you. You don't believe me. Ethan placed the blocks back into the container. I believe you want to be. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then quietly took the container from Ethan's hands. Thanks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Across the room, Alana watched the exchange. Again, Ethan had somehow managed to help without making someone feel smaller. She understood why patients trusted him, even when they didn't know his name. That afternoon, after the center closed, they walked toward the parking lot together. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk. The air had turned cooler. You've never asked me about my engagement, Alana said. He glanced at her. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. I was engaged. He nodded once. I guessed. You did? You wear your watch on your left hand. I do. There was a faint tan line on your ring finger most of the summer. She laughed in disbelief. You notice everything. I notice patterns. She smiled. It ended 4 years ago. I'm sorry. So was I. They reached her car. He wanted a different life. Ethan said nothing. He thought my work was too heavy. She shrugged gently. He wanted dinner parties. I wanted patients to learn how to button shirts again. A quiet smile crossed Ethan's face. I think I know which one matters more. She looked at him. So do I. For a second, neither reached for a door handle. There was no dramatic pause. Only the comfortable uncertainty that sometimes appears when two people begin to matter to each other in ways neither expected. I'll see you next Saturday, Ethan said. I hope so. He drove away carrying her story with him. She stood beside her car a few moments longer than usual. Neither called it affection, neither called it love. It was something simpler. They had become part of each other's ordinary week, and ordinary had started feeling important. Late that evening, Rebecca returned to her office after interviewing another former contractor connected to the explosion. Most of the conversation had gone nowhere. The man remembered little, offered less. She almost packed up for the night. Then she noticed a large envelope resting against her office door. No postage, no return address. Someone had delivered it by hand. Inside were 3 photocopied documents: a faded personnel record, a resignation form, and a payroll summary. One name appeared on all 3, Daniel Reeves. Tucked inside the folder was a single handwritten note. You keep asking the wrong man. Rebecca read the sentence once, then again. She looked toward the investigation board. Every thread she had followed for nearly 2 years suddenly converged on a name that had spent 15 years buried beneath official reports. Across Ohio, Daniel Reeves sat awake in his living room, unable to sleep. Across Pittsburgh, Ethan stared out at the Allegheny River from his back porch. Across the city, Alana wondered why Ethan's eyes had looked both relieved and afraid whenever the past came too close. None of them knew the same thing. By the end of the week, they would. And once Daniel Reeves's name entered the story, there would be no careful way to put the truth back where it had been hidden for 15 years. Rebecca Lawson didn't call this time. She went to Ethan's office. Helen looked up from her desk as Rebecca stepped off the elevator. "I don't have an appointment." "I know. I'm hoping he'll give me 10 minutes anyway." Helen studied her for a moment. Most reporters arrived with urgency. Rebecca looked prepared instead, almost reluctant. "What changed?" Rebecca held up a thin folder. "I found the reason he never defended himself." Helen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She stood. "I'll ask." Ethan was reviewing bridge inspection photos when Helen entered. "Rebecca Lawson is here." He didn't answer immediately. "I thought I declined." "You did? Then why is she here?" Helen hesitated. "She says she knows about Daniel Reeves." The room went completely still. Ethan slowly placed the inspection file on his desk. For several seconds, he looked at nothing. Finally, he nodded. "Send her in." Rebecca entered, carrying only one folder. No recorder, no camera, no notebook. Ethan noticed immediately. "You came without an audience." "I wasn't sure this conversation deserved one." He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. She sat. Neither hurried to begin. "I found Daniel Reeves," she said at last. "I know." "You know?" "He came to see me." Rebecca hadn't expected that. "When?" "A few days ago." She looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "I've spent 2 years believing there was something missing." "There was. You could have corrected the record." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" Ethan looked through the office window toward the river below. "I think you're asking the wrong question." She waited. "The better question is what correcting the record would have done." Rebecca opened the folder. Daniel bypassed the final calibration. "Yes, he never intended anyone to die." "No." "He confessed to you." "Yes." "And you kept his name out of the investigation." "I did." Rebecca held his gaze. "Why?" For the first time since she'd met him, Ethan answered without searching for careful words. "He was 29. He had a little girl. His wife was 7 months pregnant." He paused. She was also receiving treatment for aggressive cancer. Rebecca didn't interrupt. "He came into my hospital room convinced he'd destroyed 4 lives. My company, the workers, his own family. He told me he was ready to surrender." Ethan rested both hands on the desk. "I believed him." Rebecca spoke softly. "So you stopped him?" "I ask myself one question. What happens after justice?" She frowned slightly. "If Daniel went to prison?" He continued calmly. "His wife loses medical insurance. His daughter loses her father. His unborn son begins life visiting correctional facilities. And a woman already fighting cancer is left to survive, alone." Silence settled across the office. Rebecca had prepared herself for excuses. "This wasn't one. This wasn't your mistake." "No. So, why accept it?" He answered almost immediately. "Because I was the CEO." She leaned back. "That's not enough." "No, it isn't." He nodded. "But leadership rarely feels fair while you're living it." Rebecca looked toward the photograph sitting on Ethan's bookshelf, not the old one hidden inside his desk. This one showed Mercer Infrastructure employees standing on a newly completed bridge. No executives in front, no trophies. Workers. "You've spent 15 years paying anonymous trust funds to the families." He looked surprised. "You found that too?" "I did." "You never tried to buy silence?" "No." "You believed they deserved help." "They did." "They still do." Rebecca closed the folder. "I don't know what to do with this." Ethan smiled sadly. "I didn't expect you would." "If I publish everything." She stopped. He finished the sentence for her. Daniel's family pays the price. If I don't, the truth stays buried. She rubbed her forehead. I became a journalist because I believe people deserve facts. They do. But this. She looked genuinely conflicted. This isn't only facts anymore. No, it stopped being that 15 years ago. The meeting lasted nearly another hour. Ethan answered every question she asked. He never blamed Daniel, never defended himself, never asked Rebecca to protect him. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the office door. Can I ask one last thing? He nodded. If you could go back. She searched for the right words. Would you make the same decision? Ethan didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the construction crews working across the river, then back at Rebecca. I wish I'd found another way. He smiled faintly. But I never found one. Rebecca left the office carrying far more than a story. She carried a decision, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure which version of the truth caused less harm. That evening, several states away, Daniel sat in his truck outside his home. His phone buzzed. One message, from Ethan. She knows. Nothing more. Daniel stared at the screen. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. For 15 years, Ethan had protected him without asking for anything in return. Now another person carried the burden of deciding what happened next. Daniel switched off the engine, but didn't get out. Inside the house, lights glowed warmly through the front windows. His daughter laughed at something on television. His son crossed the living room carrying a bowl of popcorn. Emily waved when she noticed him sitting outside. Daniel waved back, then lowered his hand. He suddenly understood something that had been growing quietly ever since he'd returned to Pittsburgh. If Ethan continued carrying the blame now, it wouldn't be because Daniel had no choice. It would be because Daniel did. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He tried. He lay awake, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, the refrigerator humming, the furnace turning on, the hallway floor settling the way old houses sometimes do. Around 2 a.m, he walked into the kitchen. Emily found him there 20 minutes later. You've been standing in the dark. He looked over his shoulder. I didn't want to wake anyone. She switched on the light. You haven't been yourself since that trip. He managed a tired smile. I know. She stepped closer. Was it work? No. Family? He hesitated. In a way. Emily studied him for a long moment. She had known him for more than 20 years. She recognized the look of a man trying to carry something alone. You don't have to tell me tonight, she said softly. But whatever it is. She reached for his hand. It's already in this house with us. She went back to bed. Daniel remained in the kitchen long after she'd left. Her words stayed with him. He had spent 15 years believing silence protected his family. Now he wasn't sure. Maybe silence had simply moved the cost somewhere else. The next morning, he called Ethan. I've made a decision. There was a pause. I thought you might. I'm going to tell the truth. Ethan closed his office door before answering. You don't have to. I do. You have children. I know. So, don't do this because of me. Daniel's voice was steady for the first time in years. I'm doing it because every day you stayed silent, I let someone else pay for my choices. Ethan. Oh, you don't owe me another year. Another pause. Then Ethan asked quietly, Have you told Emily? Not yet. Tell her first. Daniel closed his eyes. I will. That evening, Daniel sat across from his wife at the dining room table after their children had gone upstairs. He didn't rehearse. He couldn't. I've lied to you. Emily didn't interrupt. Not about us. About who I was before we met. She folded her hands. Okay. There was an industrial explosion 15 years ago. She nodded slowly. I remember hearing about it. I was there. Her expression changed. I've never told you because... His voice caught. Because it was my fault. Silence filled the room. Not angry, not shocked. Simply still. Daniel told her everything. The skipped calibration, the pressure to stay on schedule, the explosion, The workers who never came home. The hospital room. Ethan's decision. The years of silence. When he finished, neither spoke for several moments. Emily looked down at the table, then back at her husband. "You've been punishing yourself every day we've been married." He nodded. "I thought I deserved it." She swallowed hard. "And Ethan Mercer?" "He carried what should have been mine." Tears filled her eyes. "Then this isn't only your secret anymore." "No, it's his life." Daniel nodded once. "I know." She reached across the table and took his hand, not because she approved of what he'd done, because she understood what had to happen next. "You tell the truth." He looked at her in disbelief. "And then?" She squeezed his hand. "Our family lives with it honestly." 2 days later, Rebecca received another message, not anonymous, not handwritten, an email. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm ready to speak on the record." The interview took place inside a small conference room at a law office in Columbus. Daniel insisted on one condition: "No editing that changes what I mean." Rebecca nodded. "You have my word." The recorder clicked on. Daniel looked at the table for several seconds before speaking. "I skipped the final calibration." He didn't soften the sentence, didn't search for different words. "I convinced myself we'd already tested enough. I thought one final delay would cost us the contract." He rubbed his hands together. "I wasn't trying to save money. I was trying to save time." He looked directly at Rebecca. "I was wrong." His voice remained calm. "I've had 15 years to understand the difference." He described the pressure, the decision, the explosion, the hospital. Then he reached the part Rebecca hadn't fully understood until now. "Ethan never asked me to hide." Rebecca frowned. "He didn't?" "No. He asked what was happening at home." Daniel smiled sadly. "I told him about Emily, the cancer, our daughter, the baby." Rebecca listened without writing. Some moments deserved attention more than notes. He said something I'll never forget. Daniel's eyes lowered. "Go home. Take care of your family." He drew a slow breath. "I thought he was giving me another chance. I didn't realize." His voice broke. "He was giving me his life." Rebecca published the story 3 days later, not as a scandal, as a complete account. She included Ethan's decisions, Daniel's confession, the investigation, the missing records, the impossible choices. Most importantly, she refused to turn either man into a hero or a villain. The headline read, "15 years later, the truth behind the Mercer explosion." By noon, every major news station in Pennsylvania had picked it up. Phones rang across Mercer infrastructure. Employees gathered around computer screens. Former workers called one another. Families of the victims read every word. Across social media, opinions arrived almost instantly. Some praised Ethan. Others said he should have trusted the legal system. Some believed Daniel deserved prison. Others wondered whether any punishment could equal 15 years of living with what he'd done. There was no single public reaction. There never could be. The truth hadn't erased anyone's grief. It had simply changed the shape of it. At Mercer Infrastructure, reporters gathered outside the headquarters before lunchtime. Helen looked through the lobby windows. "They're waiting." "I know. They'll stay." "I know." She turned toward Ethan. "You don't have to go out there today." He looked at the article one final time before closing his laptop. "I wasn't planning to." He stood. "What I am planning to do," she waited, "is call every family who lost someone." Helen blinked. "All of them. Everyone who'll answer." "You've done enough." He picked up his coat. "No. I've only done what I believed I had to." He paused at the office door. "Now they deserve to hear the truth from me." Late that afternoon, Alana finished seeing her last patient when her phone began vibrating repeatedly inside her bag. News alerts, messages from volunteers. A text from Martha. "Have you seen today's story?" She opened the article. Read it once, then again. By the time she reached the end, she set the phone down without moving. Not because Ethan had been innocent. That wasn't the truth. He had still been the leader. He had still carried responsibility. What stunned her was something else. For 15 years, the man who apologized for making strangers uncomfortable had been protecting a family that wasn't even his own. She closed her eyes for a moment. Suddenly she understood why he had always stepped aside first, why he never defended himself, why every conversation about the past had sounded less like guilt and more like a promise he had refused to break. Outside her office window, autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk. Across the city, Ethan was beginning the first of 7 difficult phone calls. None of them expected forgiveness. That wasn't why he was calling. For the first time in 15 years, the truth belonged to the people who had lived with its consequences. The week after Rebecca's article was published felt strangely quieter than Ethan had expected. The reporters were still outside Mercer Infrastructure. Television crews still waited across the street. Requests for interviews arrived every hour. He declined all of them, not because he was hiding, because he didn't want the story to become about whether he deserved praise. He didn't. 7 families had buried people they loved. Nothing printed in a newspaper could change that. The phone calls took most of the week. Some lasted only a minute. Others stretched close to an hour. A few families never answered. He left simple voicemails. "This is Ethan Mercer. I understand if you never want to return this call. I only wanted you to hear the truth from me instead of hearing it through someone else." He never asked for forgiveness. He never explained away his decision. When people had questions, he answered them. When they needed silence, he let it remain. One evening, the widow of a pipe fitter named Anthony called him back. "I read the article." "So did I." "I've hated you for 15 years. "I know." She took a slow breath. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel now. You don't have to decide today." "I probably won't." "I understand." There was a long pause. "My grandson starts trade school next month." Ethan smiled faintly. Anthony would have liked that. He would have. Another pause. "I don't forgive what happened. I wouldn't expect you to. But—" Her voice softened. "Thank you for making the call." When the conversation ended, Ethan remained seated at his kitchen table for several minutes. Not because everything had changed, because one thing had. People were finally responding to the truth instead of the story they had been given. Across the city, the rehabilitation center prepared for its official reopening. The event had been postponed twice during the investigation. Now the board had chosen a Saturday afternoon so patients, families, donors, and volunteers could all attend. Martha called Ethan on Thursday. "I assume you're still planning not to come." He smiled to himself. "I was. And now? You sound like you've already decided for me." "I know you." He laughed quietly. "You've become very confident." "I've become patient." She waited. "The center isn't reopening because of a donation." "No. It's reopening because people rebuilt it." "Yes. They'd like to thank you." "They don't need to. They'd like the chance anyway." Ethan looked toward the framed photograph on the bookshelf across the room. Not the one from before the explosion. A newer one. Volunteers standing in the community garden. Frank holding up his first basket of tomatoes. Mrs. Alvarez smiling beside her basil plants. Alana laughing because someone had accidentally planted mint where peppers were supposed to go. He realized something. For the first time in years, the photographs in his home no longer ended 15 years ago. "I'll come," he said. Martha smiled before she answered. "I thought you might." Saturday arrived clear and cool. The parking lot filled earlier than expected. Families carried homemade desserts into the community room. Patients proudly showed relatives where they had learned to walk again, cook again, button shirts again. Children ran between folding tables until parents reminded them to slow down. It felt less like a ceremony, more like a neighborhood gathering. Alana stood near the entrance, greeting guests. She had expected to spend the afternoon directing volunteers. Instead, she found herself looking toward the parking lot every few minutes. Not because she doubted Ethan would come, because she knew how difficult it still was for him to walk into crowded rooms. Then she saw the familiar pickup truck. He sat inside for a moment before opening the door. Not hiding. Preparing. He stepped out wearing a navy sport coat instead of his usual work jacket. For an instant, his hand moved toward the left side of his face. Almost automatically, the old habit. He stopped halfway, lowered his hand, then walked toward the building. Inside, conversations gradually faded. Some guests recognized him immediately, others only after someone quietly spoke his name. This time, something was different. No one whispered. No one stared and quickly looked away. A retired welder walked over first. "I worked one of your bridge jobs back in 2019. Ethan smiled. "How have you been?" "My knees say I'm retired." Ethan laughed. "I know the feeling." Another former patient thanked him for the adaptive kitchen equipment. A young therapist introduced herself. Frank insisted on showing Ethan photographs of his granddaughter's nursing graduation. The afternoon kept moving, conversation by conversation. Without Ethan noticing, something unusual happened. People looked directly at him, at all of him, then kept talking. The scars no longer ended the conversation before it started. Alana watched from across the room. She didn't interrupt. She noticed the small things instead. Ethan had stopped turning his unscarred side toward strangers. He wasn't thinking about it anymore. He stood, however, the conversation happened to place him. It was such a small change that almost no one else would have seen it. She did, because she'd noticed the habit on the first morning they'd met. Martha joined her. "You see it too?" Alana nodded. "He isn't arranging himself anymore." "No, he isn't." Near the end of the afternoon, a volunteer carrying a camera approached Martha. "We should get a group picture." Martha looked toward Ethan. For years, this had always been the difficult moment. Company events, charity projects, award ceremonies. Someone eventually asked for a photograph. Someone eventually realized Ethan had quietly disappeared before it happened. This time, Martha didn't say anything. She simply waited. The volunteer smiled. "Mr. Mercer?" Ethan looked toward the camera, then around the room. At Frank, Mrs. Alvarez, Natalie, Marcus, the volunteers, the therapists. Finally, his eyes settled on Alana. She didn't nod. She didn't encourage him. She simply met his gaze. The choice had to belong to him. After a few seconds, Ethan walked over and took his place in the middle of the group. No hesitation, no apology, no attempt to stand at an angle. The volunteer lifted the camera. "Everyone ready?" Laughter answered from somewhere in the back. The shutter clicked once, then again. Ethan didn't move away after the first photograph. He stayed for the second. And the third. When it was over, he looked almost surprised. Not because people had seen him, because nothing terrible had happened after they did. As guests slowly began leaving, Alana found Ethan outside near the community garden. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the raised beds. "You survived." He smiled. "I did. How does it feel?" He thought about the question. "I spent years believing hiding made other people more comfortable." He looked back through the center's windows where families were still laughing together. "I'm starting to think I never gave them the chance to decide for themselves." Alana slipped her hands into the pockets of her jacket. "I've been meaning to tell you something." He waited. "The first day we met." She smiled. "I noticed your scars. I figured. But they stopped being the most interesting thing about you after about 5 minutes." He laughed softly. 5 minutes? Maybe 4. I appreciate the honesty." She stepped a little closer. "You know what I remember most now?" "What?" "The man who kept folding chairs before anyone asked." He looked toward the building. "I remember the woman who told a little boy it was okay to look." Neither said anything else. They didn't need to. Behind them, someone called for one last volunteer to help carry supplies inside. Ethan turned immediately. "I've got it." Alana smiled. "Of course you do." She watched him disappear through the doorway, not as the CEO people had once judged, and not as the man who had hidden from cameras for 15 years. Simply as Ethan. For the first time since she'd known him, he wasn't walking into the building hoping no one would notice him. He was walking in because he finally understood that being seen and being accepted were no longer two different things. And that quiet realization changed far more than any headline ever could. Winter came and went. By the time the first warm mornings returned to Pittsburgh, something had shifted. Not all at once, but steadily enough that the people closest to Ethan noticed before he did. He still arrived at work before most of the company. He still walked project sites. He still stopped to ask welders about their children and equipment operators about sore backs and weekend fishing trips. The difference was that he no longer disappeared whenever someone asked him to speak. It started with a regional safety conference. Mark Delaney stepped into Ethan's office carrying a folder. The organizers called again. Ethan looked up from a bridge inspection report. I remember. They're expecting another no. Mark waited. You've earned that right. Ethan closed the report. When is it? Thursday. He thought for a moment. I'll go. Mark blinked. You will? I'll go. The answer spread through the executive floor before lunch. No one celebrated. They simply smiled at one another in quiet surprise. The conference wasn't glamorous. Rows of folding chairs filled a convention hall outside Harrisburg. Engineers, inspectors, union representatives, project managers, people whose work rarely made headlines unless something had gone terribly wrong. When Ethan's name appeared on the screen, the room applauded politely. He walked to the podium, carrying only a few handwritten notes. He looked across the audience for several seconds before speaking. I've been asked to talk about leadership. He paused. I don't think leadership is something you understand on the days everything goes right. The room became still. It's what you discover about yourself after something goes terribly wrong. No dramatic music, no rehearsed delivery. Just a man speaking carefully. I can't teach anyone how to avoid every mistake. He looked around the room. But I can tell you this. If you're ever tempted to treat one safety step as optional because you're behind schedule. He let the sentence settle. Don't. You aren't saving time. You're borrowing it from someone's future. No one applauded when he finished. They stood, not because he had inspired them, because they believed him. Word spread. More organizations invited him to speak. Trade schools, engineering programs, construction apprenticeships. He accepted some, declined others. Whenever reporters asked whether he felt redeemed after the investigation, he always answered the same way. This isn't about redemption. It's about making sure another family never receives the phone call mine had to make. He never said more than that. He didn't need to. One Saturday afternoon, Alana stood near the back of a vocational rehabilitation workshop while Ethan answered questions from young construction trainees. A student in his early 20s raised his hand. Were you scared to come back after the explosion? Ethan smiled thoughtfully. Every day. The room stayed quiet. So why did you? He looked around the workshop. Because staying away wouldn't have protected anyone. Alana watched several students write that sentence down. She smiled to herself. Months earlier, Ethan would have avoided standing in front of a room altogether. Now he wasn't speaking because he wanted attention. He was speaking because silence no longer served anyone. That was the difference. On the drive home, Alana sat beside him in the pickup truck. You were good. I stumbled through the second answer. They didn't notice. I noticed. She laughed. Occupational hazard? Engineering habit. They stopped at a traffic light overlooking the Allegheny River. You know, she said, I think you're finally talking to people instead of apologizing to them. He looked out the windshield. I hadn't thought about it. I know, he smiled. That's probably because you noticed before I did. I usually do. The light turned green. He drove on. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't trying to outrun the past. He was finally allowing it to become part of a future instead. One evening, Helen stopped by his office carrying retirement paperwork. I've been putting this conversation off. Ethan looked up. I was hoping you had. She smiled. I've been here 32 years. I know. I'd like to spend more time with my grandchildren before they stop thinking I'm interesting. He laughed. I don't think that's possible. She handed him the paperwork. I've worried about leaving. You never said. I didn't have to. She looked around the office. For a long time, I thought this company needed me because it was the only place you ever lived. She smiled gently. It doesn't feel that way anymore. Ethan looked at her quietly. Thank you. For what? For staying. Helen shook her head. You don't have to thank me. I do. She nodded once, then walked out smiling. She wasn't retiring because Ethan no longer needed support. She was retiring because he no longer carried everything alone. Spring became summer. Neither Ethan nor Alana ever had a conversation beginning with, "What are we?" Life answered the question before either of them tried. On Wednesday evenings, Alana often stopped by Ethan's house after work. Sometimes she brought groceries. Sometimes he had already started dinner. The meals were simple: grilled chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, cornbread when Alana insisted. They argued playfully over tomatoes. You still put mayonnaise on sandwiches. I've told you. He smiled while slicing basil. It's the correct decision. It's the wrong decision. You've never admitted that once. Because I'd be lying. They laughed. The conversation moved on. The vegetable garden grew better than either expected. One Saturday morning, Alana arrived to find Ethan studying 2 rows of peppers with unusual concentration. Something wrong? I think rabbits are winning. She looked over the plants. They absolutely are. I've built bridges. I know. And somehow, I can't outsmart a rabbit. She handed him a small roll of garden fencing she'd bought on the way over. I came prepared. He looked at her. You knew. I know you. He smiled. That still surprises me. It shouldn't. Together, they repaired the fence. Not because it mattered that much, because ordinary work had become one of the ways they cared for each other. The rehabilitation center remained part of every Saturday. Volunteers no longer introduced Ethan as the donor. He was simply Ethan, the man who remembered birthdays, who fixed loose chair legs, who always washed his coffee mug before leaving. One afternoon, Frank walked over while they stacked folding tables. So? Ethan looked up. So? You two planning on making this official? Alana laughed first. Frank shrugged. I'm old. I've earned the right to ask. Ethan glanced toward Alana. She shook her head, smiling. You answer him. He looked back at Frank. We have dinner. We volunteer. We grow vegetables. Frank folded his arms. So yes. Ethan laughed. I suppose, yes. Frank nodded with complete satisfaction. I knew it months ago. We know, Alana said. You told everyone. I did. I wasn't exactly subtle. Claire noticed the change too. Family dinners sounded different now. Ethan laughed without checking himself halfway through. He argued with his younger brother over baseball scores. He invited Alana without making it feel formal. One evening, after everyone else had left, Claire helped gather empty plates. I haven't heard this house this loud since Mom and Dad hosted Thanksgiving. Ethan looked toward the back porch where Alana was watering herbs. I didn't either. Claire smiled. You look home again. He followed her gaze. So do I. Almost a year after the rehabilitation center's reopening, another Saturday arrived, looking remarkably like the first one. Coffee brewed in the kitchenette. Volunteers searched for missing markers. Folding chairs scraped across the floor. The ordinary beginning of another ordinary day. Ethan carried a box of therapy supplies toward the activity room. Halfway down the hallway, he noticed a man standing near the entrance. Mid-30s. Fresh burn scars climbed the right side of his face and neck. His shoulders were tense. His hand remained on the door as though he hadn't fully decided to come inside. People walked around him without rushing, without staring. Still, he didn't move. Ethan recognized the hesitation immediately. He had lived inside it for years. Almost without thinking, he took a step backward. The old instinct returned. Give him space. Leave first. Make it easier. Before he could turn away, he felt gentle fingers slip between his own. He looked down. Alana hadn't said a word. She simply reached for his hand. When he looked at her, she gave the smallest shake of her head, not correcting him, only reminding him. Stay. He let out a slow breath, then stayed exactly where he was. A moment later, the new participant looked toward Ethan. His eyes settled briefly on the scars. Then on the calm expression behind them, he walked over. He stopped. I'm not even sure what to ask. Ethan smiled. You don't have to get it right. The man looked down at his own hands. Does it ever feel normal again? The room seemed to grow quieter. Volunteers continued setting up tables. Someone laughed in the next room. Coffee continued brewing. Life kept moving. Ethan thought about the question. A year earlier, he would have searched for an encouraging answer. Now he chose an honest one. It isn't about becoming who you were. He looked at the man steadily. It's about discovering you were never only what happened to you. The man nodded slowly. Not because every fear had disappeared, because someone had finally answered without pretending recovery was simple. Alana squeezed Ethan's hand once before letting go. Neither mentioned it. They didn't have to. A few minutes later, Frank called from across the room. Ethan. Yeah? We're short 2 chairs. I've got them. Of course you do. Frank laughed. Ethan carried the chairs into the activity room. Alana picked up a box of therapy bands beside him. For a moment, the scene looked almost identical to the morning they had first met. The same folding chairs, the same volunteers, the same coffee, the same rehabilitation center. Only one thing had truly changed. The man who once apologized for being seen no longer believed his scars were the first thing people would remember about him. And the woman who had looked past them from the very beginning never asked him to become someone new. She simply stayed long enough for him to remember the man he had always been. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a miracle. Sometimes it begins the moment one person decides your scars are part of your story, not the whole of it. And in the end, that was the life waiting beyond survival.